Good morning. This is Kenneth and Bailey here with the Advancing Equity Coalition, here to give you our quick thoughts on some of the different topics on last night. Bailey, how are you doing again?
Pretty good. I got my coffee, so feeling more awake. How
Awesome.
about you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. I won't make Bailey reintroduce herself, but I highly encourage you, if you haven't seen our recap video, to go check out our recap video where Bailey introduces herself as our new Director of Policy and Research for the Advancing Equity Coalition. So she's bringing a lot of awesome experience and a lot of skill and capacity to help better inform the Minneapolis public about things that are going on in Minneapolis public schools. So we're excited to have her. So let's get into last night, because there are a couple of different things that I thought were interesting about last night's meeting that I wanted to at least highlight and get into a little bit. So let's go in order. So let's talk about the calendar. So last night, the superintendent shared an update with the board about the calendar. There's been a lot of controversy and a lot of conversation that's been discussed, that's out in the world around the use, especially of like e-learning days to make up for snow days, and like, are we taking away the opportunity for students to have snow days like some of us had as students and kids? And I just thought that was like an interesting conversation and a way to frame it, and then also thinking about like the lengthening or the shortening of the school year and what that means. So Bailey, what were some of your takeaways from that conversation?
Yeah, so regarding the calendar conversation, I was surprised with how much time was spent on this conversation with, all the other budgetary pieces that were discussed. But something I didn't realize until Kenneth told me actually was that a couple years ago, the calendar was changed a little bit. So MPS started before Labor Day. And so I'd be curious to learn why that was switched back again, and how we're able to fit in all the things we want to fit in. Teacher PD was up there, making sure that there's some wiggle room for, weather related events and other things like that. And so how to make it work in the regular schedule that we have now, and also, trying to think beyond tradition and kind of the way things have been done. And I think I've just been thinking about like why we stick to traditions and what it takes to change them, and will those changes be effective or not? It was kind of the thoughts I had going in. It was a little all over the place for me mentally with this one, but but that's what was going through my head.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about the calendar conversation, one, it's like the conversation that both the board and the staff hate the most. Like it's a hard conversation. It's a difficult thing to balance out. Like, where do we take days? Where do we add days? How do we do this? There's so many like variables and considerations that I think makes it really difficult. But I think, again, for us, what's most important is like, what is the thing that is going to support, especially the academic achievement of students of color the most, right? And, if that means more time, how do we create more time in the school year to have students spend more time with like direct instruction from teachers? If that means we create time so that teachers can do professional development and staff can do professional development, like, and we have to create that time over the course of the year. And these are things that they're literally mentioned, like they're talking about right now. Then that's what we have to do. I think another part of this that has always been an interesting thing for me, as someone who grew up in like a multi-religious household, is the balance of like all of the different holidays that their students celebrate and honor, and figuring out like also how do you create the right runway and the right space for that as well. So there was more conversation this year about, not last night, but earlier in other board meetings, around like, do we want to make time for Eid? This year, the school year started, and then like almost immediately we had high holidays for folks who who are Jewish, right? And so who celebrate Jewish holidays, right? And so I think like those are really interesting things, but we always make time. We obviously are always off for Christmas. You know, we're always off, you know, and celebrating, you know, I think spring break runs into Easter in some way, shape, or form in some years. I'm not sure if that's still the case this year, but I think, you know, that's also a really hard and interesting conversation. So yeah, the calendar's always been a challenge. And you know, trying to make time for all the different considerations is important. So the last two things that I wanted to at least touch on a little bit here are kind of related. And one, again, if you saw a recap, I talked a little bit about this in my Do Better moment, is like the board's seeming interest in not, or lack of interest, I should say, and not wanting to address some of the structural issues of their budget that the finance team continues to bring up to them year after year after year. But there's not a single question by board members who have been on the board for 10 years, right? Like there's not a single question about this for, you know, what are we going to do to change it? What are we going to do to, what do we have to do? Like, what are some of our options in order to address this? They don't want to talk about that. And I'm not exactly sure why, because it's clearly hampering our ability to serve students. So, yeah, so I think that's a really interesting conversation in just terms of like, what, you know, what is the motivation around that? But then also related to some of the other issues that they have with their budget in terms of not only the cross subsidy or the underfunding of special education, but then also the ability for when students leave Minneapolis public schools and go to another district, they are actually, those other districts are able to charge Minneapolis public schools for the service or for the expenses they incur to educate and provide services for that child. And so that does, you know, in some way, shape, or form harm the budget for Minneapolis public schools. And so I think that's just, again, an interesting conversation. And, you know, Bailey is someone who is like just kind of dipping their toe into, you know, all of this stuff. What stood out for you in those conversations last night?
Yeah, I think the bizarreness of that model is what stands out to me. Where, so in theory, if a student starts in MPS, or excuse me, yeah, if, you know, a student moves around,
lives in Minneapolis.
Yeah, if a student lives in Minneapolis, goes to a different school, and the costs are incurred on MPS, I think that I just feel like there has to be a better way. I don't know what that looks like necessarily, and I know that really is impacted by like hiring teachers and, you know, making sure there's appropriate staff levels and all those pieces behind the scenes. But I feel like there has to be a better way. And I know that's not a super helpful comment right now, but just the bizarreness of it all is what stood out to me.
Yeah. I think what's frustrating to me is, you know, we seem to separate the conversation of finances and like education services, academic achievement, right? And I think last night we saw a lot of public commenters come and say, like, essentially, what are we getting back for this, you know, this 7% increase in our property taxes to, you know, whatever. And so I think, you know, the board and the district would be more successful if they found better ways to like marry those two conversations for the public and like more closely connect those two things. But also I think what is really frustrating for me when we have this conversation every year, again, this is like rinse and repeat for the district. Every year they talk, when they have this conversation about the pro forma and like the budget projections, they also have the conversation about their legislative agenda. And then inevitably they talk about the underfunding of special education and the underfunding of education as a whole. And then they talk about the tuition bill back. And I understand that the tuition bill back has created a lot of issues and harm. And last night we heard board members say, like, is there any way that we can verify that students are actually getting the services that they need at this other school that we're paying them for or whatever? But I would actually also challenge them to maybe have a conversation and to look into whether the students in their own district are getting the special education services that they're paying for, right? And not just the ones who are leaving, but actually the ones who are staying. Because again, and I've brought this up multiple times, in their current strategic plan, there is exactly 0 mentions of special education, right? Like they have no strategies that is going to improve special education services, to augment special education services, nothing. Like that is not a strategy that they're willing to like look at, invest in, whatever. The only time that they talk about special education is seeing some of the academic outcomes, but I'm not sure how many changes you're going to see in the academic outcomes if you're not actually changing anything for students, period, right? And for special education students, period. And so I don't know, it's frustrating to me where we, it seems like the board, especially with this conversation, always wants to point the finger. Like, what about those districts that we're paying money to serve our students, or to serve the students that live in Minneapolis, but we have no idea whether they're getting their services? Or what about the state who, is supposed to be giving us more money or should be giving us more money and they're not? But then they also at the same time refuse to like address special education or even talk about special education in their own district, and also refuse to change any of the cost structures that are prohibiting them from serving students better. But last night Director Inns talked about, oh, well, look at the per pupil funding. Like that hasn't changed ever in the last 20 years, or has gone down in relation to inflation. But also, again, what are you doing? What have you done, Director Inns? And like now I'm going on 8 years on the board to change the structure of our budget that Senior Officer Giap year after year after year keeps saying, like, enrollment and loan is not going to fix our budget because of the costs that we're taking on. So anyway, that's my rant. Sorry that you just had to be on the other side of that, Bailey, but I get frustrated about this.
No, I think you highlight a really important point where, they've said over and over, enrollment won't fix the issue, but I think the mindset is that it will fix the issue. And so
or something that
creative.
Yeah, I think it's either they think enrollment will fix the issue, or like we don't want to have a hard conversation because we do know maybe what some of that cost structuring will look like, and some of that maybe took place in St. Paul, and we saw how brutal that was. But the longer and longer we keep putting off that conversation, the longer and longer we're actually not serving our students adequately in Minneapolis, and that's just the fact of it, because we're not consolidating resources in the most effective way. So anyway, thank you, Bailey, for again stepping in for Heather. This was fun, and I have a feeling that you might have a few more appearances on our board recaps and debriefs. I thought you did a very good job. So
good deal. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks, Bailey.
Yep. Take care, guys. See ya.
Bye.